So in the first revision video for the personality study, we just covered a basic example of a kind of part A question that you could be asked in relation to Alexandra Kollontai. We looked at some pretty basic strategies there that might help you think about how to both revise and how to approach a question in the exam. So this video is really just about part B. Okay, so we're going to use this as a sample question. It is the way an individual faces challenges that shapes them and their achievements. How accurate is this statement in relation to the life of the personality you have studied? So this one's worth 15 marks out of a total of 25. Remember, this is a very common structure for the question. So you get a quote and you're asked to analyze its accuracy or its relevance or something like that. So this quote and its concept, the concept behind the quote, has to feature throughout the essay. So remember to make sure that you're referencing the quote and key aspects of it you might directly quote throughout the essay. So to make sure that you're actually answering the question, you also have to make a judgment in this case. How accurate? Very accurate, not very accurate, so on. So make sure that you're doing both of those things. You need to directly answer the question and you need to make consistent use of the quote that you're given. So how do we actually approach this? There's another strategy here that you might think of to make sure that your response is actually doing a decent job of answering the question. I think you need to be ready to discuss Alexandra Kollontai's life as a whole, okay? Because the question really says in relation to the life of the personality. So that opens up a discussion or a potential discussion that looks at this quote in relation to aspects of her life, perhaps. Okay, so it doesn't have to be a completely relevant statement, or it doesn't have to be completely irrelevant or inaccurate. It might apply to certain aspects of her life, but not others. That could be the argument that you want to push. So when you're reviewing this and you're practicing these kinds of questions, make sure you think about how the quote might apply to different parts of her life. So for example, if we take the part of her life, or her life, that is 1872 to 1952, so that's the general sweep of her life, she's born here, dies here, then we might be able to think of generally some different features, right, of her life. So for example, we might think really the first phase of her life was something like 1872 to 1892. Okay, and I usually, as I've said in the previous video, usually use 1892 as a bit of a demarker, where she leaves her family to go and study in Switzerland. And part of the issue here is that she then begins to become more overtly politically active. And I think that initiates a bit of a difference in her life. I'm not saying she wasn't politically active, certainly in this later period here, but the idea that she actually becomes a very organized political activist really from this point on, and dedicated, I think certainly is reasonable. So the second phase of her life, or the second sort of stretch of her life, you might think of as being her political career. Now, I'm not using the word political career here entirely correctly, because her diplomacy that is outside this era is certainly part of her political career as well. But what I mean here is her very politically active career at the center of Bolshevik activity. Okay, she's not necessarily at the center here, but she's becoming closer and closer to the center of Bolshevik activity, especially in 1914-15. She joins the party in earnest. She begins to do all sorts of different jobs for the party. So for example, she goes to the United States on a lecturing tour there to try and drum up support for the communist cause. She also, in 1917, brings Lenin's letters from afar while he's out of the country, and so on. So this is think of this political career as being the political career when she's at the center of Bolshevik activity in Russia and the Soviet Union. And I generally, in my analysis of this, would take that up to, say, when she leaves the Zhenotdel, basically under duress, because she is also part of the workers' opposition. Okay, so that probably is when I think she ends that career at the center of political activity in Russia. And she certainly does important jobs, I think, after then, but it's just a different kind of work that she begins to do. And that's really the third phase. I think of this as her diplomatic career. So from the 1920s up really until her death. I realize that she's come back to Russia on a more permanent basis in the late 40s, but at the same time she does remain active in advising the Commissar for International Affairs. So she certainly continues to play an active role in the diplomatic arena. So that's one way of thinking about maybe dividing up her life. I should also mention that in this final area, a lot of her major works were major fictional works were written. So she writes a lot of political tracts and books and so on here, and later on she continues to write. So it's again a little bit misleading to just call this phase of her life the diplomatic phase of her life, because she's also doing things like writing, and her writings do become a very valuable source of information for all sorts of points of analysis. So I think that's relevant in terms of her achievements. Her writings are a part of her achievements. Now, my point in sort of pointing out the three areas here is that if you got this question, it would be legitimate to talk about this quote in relation to different aspects of her life. Okay, so it's relation to the life of the personality. Now, of course, you've got to think about the way, we've got to think about her achievements, and most of those are done really here in the last two areas that we've been discussing. So it may not really make sense to talk about achievements so much down here as she's forming her sort of identity and her character. But certainly, the question suggests it's the way an individual faces challenges that shapes them. Okay, so some of this stuff might actually be relevant. And what I'm suggesting is that your judgment to be a bit more interesting than just, yes, it is an accurate statement or it is an entirely accurate statement, is that you may be able to say something like the statement is limited in accuracy because it only relates to certain aspects of her life. So the statement may relate, for example, you think to this period, these periods here, where she faces challenges. Okay, so she faces big challenges in terms of being in the position of Janet Dell in the context of civil war and economic reconstruction. That's very difficult because she just simply doesn't have the resources to initiate the reforms she would like. So that's part of the problem. She's trying to push on these changes, but that ultimately ends up winding up leading her to basically be ejected from the party, or at least ejected from its meaningful activities at the center. So certainly that fall from grace that she has in the big falling out with Lenin over the workers' opposition, she faces that challenge with certainly determination, and she tries to really push hard for the cause of the workers' opposition. But that ultimately actually shapes her, and it shapes her achievements in terms of what she can actually do with the women's department, because she's isolated from it after that. So that would be relevant here, certainly. And in terms of her diplomatic career, the challenges that she faced with in terms of Stalin at the center of Bolshevik activity back in the Soviet Union, and she was in a sense safer to be outside of it, and she also had meaningful activity to do. So she was facing that challenge in an interesting way as well. So you might be able to say it relates to this more than that. That could be one argument you might have. And that kind of approach, I should mention as well, that kind of approach where you might differentiate the accuracy of the statement depending on which period of her life you're talking about, might actually not work with some of the quotes that you might get. Okay, so I'm not suggesting you should slavishly follow this and just basically rehash this approach in every question, but it's certainly an option to make your argument a little bit more interesting than just it's entirely accurate and it applies to everything about her life. So try to think about maybe the areas in which it doesn't apply as well as the areas in which it does, which would mean you can't argue that it's entirely accurate or inaccurate. So I think a couple of questions you might want to ask yourself as you're looking over your notes, revising and preparing to engage with these kinds of questions are the questions like this. How did Kollontai influence her context? So if you're asked a question about how she shaped the world in which she lived, which this has a little bit of that to it, not completely, but partially. If you're asked about that, you're ready to discuss ways in which she clearly influenced her context. So try to think of some examples. What are the times or the scenarios in which she was clearly able to make changes that were important? They might not be lasting necessarily, but you could argue that she was able to influence her context. So for example, you might think of some of the reforms she brought in through Commissar for Social Welfare or through the Janet Dell. You might consider them to be part of her evidence of part of her ability to, say, shape the world in which she lived. Okay, you might be able to argue that her involvement in the diplomatic processes that brought an end to the winter wars in the 1930s, 1940s was part of her ability to influence, or evidence of her ability to influence her context. So think of examples that you can clearly argue in that way, but also think of this as well, and that is, in what ways did Kollontai fail to influence her context? Okay, so where did she maybe try and fail? Workers' opposition would be one good opportunity I could think of there, but there might be more. You could also, in some sense, see these as not watertight questions, really, because you might argue that she was able to influence her context in terms of the reforms in the Commissariat and through the Genitdel, but that in the long run she failed to really achieve lasting reform. So that might be a distinction you could make, that in the short term she managed to create some change, but in the long term in those areas the change was actually limited. And thirdly, I'm suggesting you might want to think about the ways in which Kollontai's context influenced her. So this idea here is that we're looking here for evidence where she clearly influenced her context, and here we're looking for clear evidence where her context influenced her. Many people at this point would talk about the revolutionary mood, you might put it that way, the revolutionary mood of the 1890s and early 1900s in Russia, which was clearly a force in which Kollontai's context was playing an influential role in her life. Okay, you might also argue that a contextual influence on Kollontai's life was her family. They were exposing her to liberal ideas, and they kind of, in a sense, gave her quite a lot of freedom and opportunity, and that context set her up to go on and become someone. So it doesn't just have to be negative. The context doesn't just have to limit something about her. It could be an enabling thing as well, but it's got to be clear that it's influencing and shaping her. And if you consider those questions, you probably will be pretty well prepared to discuss the types of quotes and issues that they bring up in the exam. Also remember that not all of the Part B questions are necessarily quote questions. It is entirely possible that you're asked to actually look at a broad question like this one. To what extent did the personality you have studied make a positive contribution to their period of national or international history? So the idea here is that you're not being asked to look at how her context has influenced her and so on back and forth. You're asked to look at how much she has been able to influence her context. Okay, so, and you don't have to integrate a quote here, you just have to make a judgment to what extent, to a great extent, to a limited extent, and so on. Maybe here again you could approach this question by thinking about, you again want to think about her life as a whole, but this one's slightly different, isn't it? Because you're not really asked to look at all of the stuff surrounding perhaps her early life. This is about her contribution. So this really might come down to her political activity that we've talked about in the Bolshevik Party, and her diplomatic career, where she made the largest contribution to the world. And you've got to basically analyze how large you think that was. Okay, so that one wouldn't require you to consider her life as a whole, but it would require you to consider the later parts of it probably in more detail. So if we think about what we've talked about so far, remember that Part A really focuses on parts 1 to 3 of the syllabus, okay? And Part B is going to focus potentially actually on the entire syllabus, because you could be asked about how her context influenced her, okay, or vice versa. So you want to be thinking about how some of these things line up together to be discussed. Okay, it might be the case that you're simply asked not to discuss her historical context, but you might be simply asked to just look at her contribution to the world. Okay, does she have a lasting legacy? It's not so much that, in that case, a backwards looking question, how did she shape her context, or how did her context shape her? It's a forward looking question in a sense. What kind of significance did she have in her lifetime, and is there a sense in which this has gone beyond her lifetime? Okay, so try to think again. Another little strategy here is maybe about short-term and long-term influences that you can see with her, or short-term and long-term changes that she was able to bring about. And if you're familiar with those kinds of questions, then I think whatever quote they bring up or whatever type of question they ask you, you should be pretty well prepared to answer it.